Hello, U.S. History. Today is Wednesday, November 4th. Today will be another day where I'm taking roll a special way, so make sure you watch and listen carefully. The only thing you're going to need right now is the notes you started that said immigration 1890 to 1920. We actually got up to this slide on with the Uncle Sam image on it. We'll pick up from there and just do a couple more. So if you would do me a favor and make sure that you have your paper. I'm just going to recap this one super quick about Americanization. That is when immigrants were expected to assimilate or absorb American culture and language. Often they had their names changed, and I covered that on the last part of this. The reality for immigrants when they arrive. First of all, they very often ended up in crowded cities with very few services. There weren't, garbage collection and sanitation widely available in American cities yet. So it was pretty gross. And when you add a lot of new people and they're crowding into buildings that don't necessarily have, building codes or anything, it gets pretty bad pretty quick. They end up, especially on the East Coast at first, in ethnic neighborhoods. So if you're an immigrant, say from Poland, you're going to you're going to go towards the people who speak your language, share your customs, practice your religion. And that's why back east in larger cities, you would have Jewish neighborhoods, Polish neighborhoods, Russian neighborhoods, based on the immigrants that were coming in there. It's why in California cities like San Francisco, Los Angeles, you have Japantown, Chinatown, Koreatown. Although those, as we're going to find out, have a little bit of a different history to them, that's why these ethnic neighborhoods spring up. It's where immigrants can go to find a little bit of familiarity. There were very often crowded, unsanitary living conditions, and it becomes especially bad in these apartment buildings called tenements. And this was on your Quizlet, I think. A tenement is a large apartment building where you have multiple families living on a floor sharing bathrooms or kitchens, for example. And there weren't, codes yet about how many people should be living in a room. So they got to be pretty bad. Often had to take low paying, dangerous, or unskilled jobs when they first arrived because, they didn't have training or anything yet. So they were kind of desperate for work. And very often they're going to be victims of con men who take advantage of them. And this is how the early mafias get started. They start as like protection rackets for immigrants, but the immigrants very often ended up being the victims of these groups. And we'll talk more about that as we go along next week. Remember, this is recorded, so you can play this back if you need to. We already know from the examples we saw that immigrants are subject to a lot of prejudice and exclusion. We saw in that first primary source where native-born Americans were trying to keep an immigrant out. That happens repeatedly. There's even exclusion acts passed. The Chinese Exclusion Act is an example. When large numbers of Chinese were coming in to work on the railroad or mine gold in California, the reaction of the government was exclusion laws. There were quotas, which means a limited number set on different ethnic groups coming into the United States, Jews or other groups that were considered undesirable. So there was a lot of prejudice against people based on their religion or their race. In fact, some of these exclusion laws were so crazy that Jesus Christ, for example, if he had lived during this time, would not have been allowed in the United States based on his religion. He was Jewish. So that's when you kind of stop and think a country that calls itself a Christian country actually would have kicked out Jesus Christ himself. So quite a few hypocritical moments like we saw in that first cartoon. Political machines. Political machines, when refer to these large groups of people that formed in cities to control the voting and the politics of the city, basically through bribery. The biggest of these political machines is going to be something called Tammany Hall. It was run by Boss Tweed and the Irish Mafia. We'll talk about that later next week. But ostensibly, they served the purpose of giving services to immigrants, jobs, housing, protection, in exchange for political support, but also these are mafias. They operate on money. And so basically you would have to promise them 10% of your paycheck in exchange for their protection and their help. So they did give services. They, helped immigrants find jobs, housing, but they also exacted a price for that. So basically, this is how the mafias get started in the large cities. Okay. The US passes exclusion laws in response to these things happening in the cities. And of course, they're very race based. And I mentioned before, sometimes religiously based. So this is a great time for immigrants to come to the United States and find jobs, but it's also a pretty sad time because a lot of them experience these exclusion laws or discrimination based on their race or religion. To get credit for attendance today, send me an email with your name and tell me what special national event happened yesterday, November 3rd. And as soon as you do that, you will get credit for attendance today. The only other thing you need to make sure that you log in and do is the assignment that's in Classroom right now, linked right underneath this. Otherwise, go ahead and have a great day.